You step onto the porch of a modern house in the dead of July, and before you even turn the doorknob, you hear it. The heavy, metallic thrum of a $2,000 air conditioning compressor, vibrating against the foundation, fighting a losing war against the sky. Inside, the air is cold but tight, and on the kitchen counter sits a utility bill that makes a working man wince. Most folks today accept this as the only way to survive the summer. You buy a complex machine, you bolt it to your wall, and you pay a company every single month to run it. But step over to my neighbor's property, or walk into the old timber frame barn on my own place, and you will find something that makes you stop and think. There is no wire running to the roof. There is no hum of a motor. Yet, when you cross the threshold out of the blazing 90-degree yard, the air inside drops, settled and easy, like stepping down into a stone cellar. Why do we spend thousands of dollars every year to force a house to be cool, when the old builders knew how to make a house keep itself cool for nothing? I am Elias, and I look after this Lancaster County homestead without any connection to the public power grid. When you live off the wire, you cannot rely on a machine to fix a poorly designed building. You have to understand the shell of the house itself. When I was a boy, I couldn't wrap my head around why my grandfather's stone farmhouse stayed so pleasant, while the newer frame houses down the road felt like wood-fired ovens by 3 in the afternoon. I remember asking him about it on a day so hot the cicadas were buzzing like high-voltage wires in the trees. He didn't give me a grand speech. He just took my hand and led me around the outside of the house, patient the way he showed me everything. He had me touch the deep, 3-foot-thick stone walls that felt cool to the palm because they drank the midday heat so slowly. He pointed up at the deep wooden eaves that cast a long, dark shadow over the glass windows while the sun was high and fierce. Then he pointed to the little louvered wooden vents tucked up under the roofline, and far across the yard, to the tin cupola sitting on the peak of the barn, where you could actually see the heat shimmering as it poured out the top. My grandfather hadn't read a single engineering manual. It was simply the shared knowing of his people, passed down through generations who had to live in harmony with the sun rather than trying to beat it into submission with electricity. And modern building science now confirms exactly what those old-timers practiced. A building can shed its own heat if you manage 3 plain things: insulation, ventilation, and shading. Understand these 3, and you can pull the heat out of nearly any structure, large or small. Look at how heat behaves. The sun beats down on your roof all day until the metal or the shingles are scorching to the touch. That heat doesn't stay outside. It slowly works its way down through the materials, radiating into your rooms like the burner on a stove. Because hot air is light, it rises and packs itself tightly under your ceilings, turning the upstairs into a trap. The old ways fight this at 3 distinct stations. First, you stop the heat from penetrating the roof. That is insulation. Second, you give the trapped air a chimney to escape. That is ventilation. Third, you prevent the sun from ever hitting the building's skin in the first place. That is shading. Let's take the roof first, because that is where most folks make their biggest mistake. Think of a thick fabric pot holder. When you pull a cast iron skillet off the fire, you don't touch the bare iron. The cloth stops the heat from moving into your skin. Insulation is the pot holder for your home. But if you press that insulation flat and tight against the underside of a hot metal roof, you defeat half its purpose. The secret the old builders used was the air gap. You must leave a space of open air between the hot roofing material and the insulation barrier. When the roof gets hot, it warms the air in that gap. Because that air is free to move, it rises up along the underside of the roof and pours out the vents at the peak, carrying the heat away sideways before it ever touches your insulation pad. Press it tight, and the heat drives straight through. Leave a gap, and the house breathes the heat away. Now, I must be entirely honest with you about the limits of these old ways. If you live in a country where the air hangs heavy, thick, and wet with humidity, These methods will not give you the crisp, dry chill of a modern refrigerator. They cannot strip the water out of the air. But what they can do, especially in the damp heat, is create a constant, drawing movement of air that allows the moisture to dry off your skin, keeping the house from feeling like a stagnant swamp. Why don't we build like this anymore? It is not a secret conspiracy. It is simply the track of easy money. It is far cheaper for a modern builder to throw up a thin-walled, unshaded box out of cheap materials, bolt a mechanical box to the side, and leave you to pay the power company for the next 30 years to keep it livable. The house built with traditional wisdom pays nobody a monthly bill, so the industry walked away from it. But knowing the theory of the air gap, the draw of the wind, and the placement of the shade is only the first step. The real work comes when you look at a standard modern frame house or a workshop that is already built wrong, and you have to make it right without tearing the building down. I want to show you exactly how we arrange the low openings and the high vents on this homestead to create a natural, self-running engine of air, and how you can manipulate the shadows on your western walls using nothing more than simple timber and green growth. Let me walk you over to the woodshop, and I will show you the precise way to set this up. Let us step inside the woodshop here. Notice the change the very moment we cross the oak sill? The air carries the dry, clean smell of freshly planed pine shavings, beeswax, and linseed oil. But more than that, it feels rested and still. We are standing beneath a raw tin roof on a day hot enough to make a stone sweat. Yet there is no machine humming in the corner, no heavy vibration running through the floorboards. To bring this same quiet ease to your own house or workshop, you do not need an expensive contractor or a truckload of high-tech gear. You need a few basic hand tools, some rough-sawn local lumber, and a patient, observant eye. Let us walk through exactly how you build these 3 defenses using your own hands, with the steady, unhurried pace of the old builders. We begin with the ventilation engine, what my people called setting the draw. To make a building breathe on its own, you must first locate the deepest pool of cool air on your piece of ground. On a blazing morning, walk around the perimeter of your house and look for the side where the dew stays longest in the grass, usually the north or northeast face, shielded by the high bulk of the building or the deep shade of an old maple. This is your source of life during the heat. To test how the air wants to move, take a small dry splinter of pine or cherry wood from the scrap bin. Strike a wooden match, smell that brief, sharp tang of sulfur, and let the splinter catch until the flame burns clear and yellow. Blow it out gently so that a thin, lazy ribbon of blue smoke curls upward from the charred tip. Go to the lowest window on that cool, shaded side of the house and open the bottom sash just 3 or 4 inches. Hold your smoking splinter right against the gap. If you have chosen well, you will see that blue smoke lean sharply inward, drawn into the house by a steady, quiet draft you can barely feel on your bare skin. Now, stop and think. The mistake almost every beginner makes here is opening every single window in the house wide from top to bottom. Thinking more open space means more coolness. Understand this. If you open everything equally, you equalize the air pressure inside and out. The air just stalls, stagnates, and the house simply fills up with the heavy outer heat. You must create a bottleneck. Keep those lower cool windows open only a crack, then go to the highest point of the house, the attic stairs, a second-story window on the opposite, hotter western side, or the roof ridge vent, and open that high exit wide. The hot, light air trapped under your ceiling wants nothing more than to escape up into the open sky. As it pours out that high opening, it creates a gentle vacuum below, dragging that cool, heavy shade air through your small lower window like water drawn through a siphon. If you stand still, you will feel a refreshing river of air moving across your ankles, constantly lifting the stagnant dampness off your skin without a single watt of power. Next, let us climb up and look at the roof insulation, for this is where the heaviest battle against the sun is fought. If you have an open attic space, or a workshop with exposed rafters under the roofing boards. Do not simply press your insulation blankets tight against the underside of the roof deck. If you do, you trap the fierce heat right against the wood, and it will eventually soak through the barrier like water through a dry sponge, baking the rooms below. We must build a breathing highway instead. Take simple rough-sawn 1x2-inch wooden furring strips, pine or poplar, whatever is local, cheap, and straight. Using a hammer and common nails, fix these strips along the inner sides of your rafters, exactly 1 inch below the roof deck boards. Next, take thin sheets of exterior-grade utility plywood or even a heavy-duty tar paper, the traditional kind that smells strongly of oil and asphalt when the sun hits it. Cut these into widths that fit between your rafters and secure them directly to the face of those wooden strips. What you have created is a hidden, continuous 1-inch air tunnel running from the bottom eave of your roof all the way to the peak. Now you can pack your wool or cotton insulation bats underneath this new wooden shield. When the sun bakes the roof, the heat warms the air inside that hidden 1-inch tunnel. That air becomes light, slides up the smooth wooden highway, and pours out the ridge vent at the top, carrying the roof's fury out into the sky before it ever touches your insulation pad. The crucial error to avoid here is running your insulation all the way into the tight, dusty corners where the roof meets the house walls. If you pack that corner tight, you will plug up the soffit vents, the intake nostrils of your roof. Keep a hand's width of clear space there so the fresh air can enter the bottom of the tunnel, or the whole engine grinds to a halt. Finally, let us move outside to defend the western wall from the low, horizontal afternoon sun. By 4 o'clock, an overhead roof overhang does nothing. The sun comes at your house sideways, turning the siding into a scorching radiator. We are going to build an outside parasol using rough-sawn cedar. Cedar is the choice of the old builders. It carries a sweet, clean resin smell and stands up to the rain for 30 years without a drop of chemical paint. Dig 3 post holes, 2 feet deep, down into the cool, dark earth, spaced about 4 feet apart and set 2 feet away from your western windows. As you dig, smell that damp, rich earth turned over to the light. Drop 3-inch thick cedar posts into the holes. Pack them tight with native gravel rather than concrete, so the wood can breathe and drain, and run thin horizontal slats between them like a ladder climbing toward the eaves. Do not leave this timber frame bare. Go to your garden and plant the seeds of a fast-growing, deciduous vine. Scarlet runner beans or traditional brewing hops are best. By the time the deep heat of July arrives, these vines will have raced up the cedar slats, weaving a dense, living curtain of broad, emerald green leaves. When the afternoon sun strikes that wall, it does not hit your siding or your glass. It hits the leaves. The plant drinks the light, using the sun's energy to grow, and leaves your house wall resting in a cool, damp shadow. Look closely at the window behind a living green screen. The glass remains cool to the touch, and the light inside the room turns a soft, restful jade color. The common mistake here is trying to solve this from the inside by pulling down thick white plastic shades or heavy curtains. Understand this. Once the sun passes through your window glass, the heat is already inside the room, trapped like a greenhouse. A blind on the inside merely warms up and radiates that heat right into your face. You must stop the sun outside the glass before it ever makes entry. Take a walk around your own place this evening when the air begins to cool. Do not look at your home as a static box bought from a catalog. Look at it as a living skin that interacts with the sky. Find where the sun strikes hardest, locate where the shade pools deepest, and think on how you can use these simple principles to connect the two. It takes no great wealth, only the willingness to observe the natural order and work alongside it. Let us sit a moment here on the workbench, out of the direct glare, and look at the straight truth of how these things operate. What my grandfather simply called the nature of things, modern men with university degrees call the laws of thermodynamics. The words are different, but the truth remains exactly the same. It is not magic, And it is not folk superstition. It is the predictable behavior of energy, as steady and certain as water running down a hillside. To truly make your house work for you, you must understand the invisible physics happening in the quiet spaces of your rooms. Because once you see the mechanics of it, you stop guessing and start building with certainty. Understand this first principle. Heat is an aggressive neighbor. It always moves from where it is crowded and hot to where it is cool and empty, trying to level the field. When the sun beats down on your roof, that energy travels through the wood and plaster by what science calls conduction, heat passing hand to hand through solid matter, like the warmth traveling up the handle of a cast iron spoon left in a hot soup pot. Once that heat reaches the inside ceiling, it turns into radiant heat. This is a different beast entirely. Radiant heat doesn't need to touch you to warm you. It travels through the clear air in invisible waves, the exact same way you feel the fierce warmth of a bonfire on your face, even when the air between you and the flames is crisp and cold. When your ceiling gets hot, it spends the whole afternoon broadcasting those invisible waves downward onto your floor, your furniture, and your own skin. That is why a closed room upstairs can feel like an oven, even if there is no hot sun coming through the window. The second principle is what drives our ventilation, and it is the simple rule of buoyancy. When air gets warm, its tiny particles speed up and spread out. Because they take up more space, the warm air becomes lighter and less dense than the cool air around it. Think of a handful of dry pine shavings thrown into a bucket of water. They do not sink. They bob right to the surface because they weigh less than the fluid surrounding them. In the great ocean of air inside your house, the hot air acts just like those pine shavings. It floats upward, searching for the highest point it can find, while the heavier, denser cool air sinks to the floorboards. The old-timers didn't need a textbook to know this. They simply observed the smoke rising from a hearth and realized that if you give that rising air an exit at the very peak of the roof, it will pull itself out of the building with the force of its own lightness, acting as a natural self-powered pump. But now, let us pull the reins in for a moment and look at this with absolute honesty. I am not here to sell you a dream of an effortless paradise, and these old methods have hard, unyielding boundaries. They are not a universal cure-all for every climate or every building material. And if you try to apply them blindly where they do not belong, you will end up disappointed, hot, and exhausted. Let us map out exactly where these boundaries sit. The biggest limit of all is the wet, heavy humidity of the lowlands. In a dry country, like the high deserts or the western plains, the air is thirsty. When a gentle breeze moves across your skin, your sweat evaporates instantly into the dry air, and that evaporation chills your body beautifully, making an 85-degree day feel completely comfortable. But if you live in the deep south, down in the Bayous, or along the humid river valleys during a August mugginess, the air is already a saturated sponge, completely filled with water vapor. You can smell the dampness in the air, heavy and thick as a wet wool blanket. In those specific conditions, opening your windows to create a natural draw will not lower the thermometer inside. It cannot strip the water from the air the way a mechanical air conditioner does. The ventilation will still help you by keeping the air from souring and going stagnant, and a fan will help the moisture move off your skin. But the house itself will never feel cold. If your local weather report says the night air stays at 90 degrees with 90% humidity, these passive methods will only bring the inside down to match the outside, no lower. The second boundary belongs to the materials your house is built from, what we call thermal mass. A heavy material, like a 3-foot wall of native limestone or solid brick, acts as a giant thermal sponge. It takes hours of intense sun to saturate that stone with heat. In the heat of the day, that stone house feels like a cool sanctuary, because the wall is still busy drinking up the midday energy. But remember the other side of that coin. Filled with water must eventually drip. By 8 o'clock at night, when the outside air drops and you want to sleep, that massive stone wall begins to bleed all its stored heat inward into your bedrooms. If you do not have an inner insulated frame wall with an air gap to block that radiation, or if you do not have massive high vents to flush that nighttime heat out, a stone or brick house will turn into a bake oven long after the sun goes down. Conversely, if your home is a modern, lightweight suburban house built with 2x4 spruce studs, thin fiberglass insulation, and vinyl siding, it has almost no thermal memory at all. It has no mass to store the cool of the night. The moment the sun hits the vinyl, the interior temperature spikes upward like a fever. For a lightweight house like that, you cannot rely on the walls to hold the morning coolness. You must rely entirely on immediate, heavy shading from its outside and an aggressive, continuous air tunnel beneath the roof shingles to carry the heat away the very second it lands. Finally, you must look at your surroundings. If your house is situated in the middle of a modern town or city, surrounded by wide sheets of black asphalt, concrete sidewalks, and stone driveways, you are living inside what folks call an urban heat island. All that stone and tar acts just like the old farmhouse walls. They soak up the sun all day and radiate it back into the night air. When you open your low windows on the shaded side of the house at midnight, hoping to draw in a cool breath of earth air, you will find that the air sitting outside is already hot and tired, warmed by the pavement. Without a true pool of green, shaded, dew-covered earth to draw from, the natural engine of the house has no cool fuel to run on. So, understand your ground. If you have a house with good bones, if you have access to shade, and if your nights offer even a small drop in temperature, these old ways will give you your independence back. But you must apply them with an understanding of your specific material and your specific sky. Once you know the limits, you can stop fighting the place you live and begin to work within the boundaries that nature has set for you. When you look back through the long story of how people have kept themselves safe and comfortable on the land, you realize that the grid-tied house we live in today is a very new, very fragile experiment. For thousands of years, humans could not rely on the turn of a plastic dial on a wall to fix a hot room. They had to build with a deep, bone-deep understanding of the earth and the sky. This knowing did not begin with my grandfather's stone farmhouse here in Lancaster County. And it did not begin with the early settlers who cleared these fields. It belongs to a long, quiet lineage of traditional builders who watched the track of the sun, felt the direction of the evening breeze on their skin, and shaped their shelters to match. If you travel through the old southern frontier, you will find the traditional dog trot houses, 2 log cabins built side by side under a single continuous roof, separated by a wide open wooden breezeway right through the center. The old-timers knew that the shade of that roof, combined with the narrow passage, would draw the wind through the middle of this house like a natural funnel, cooling the rooms on either side without a single mechanical part. Go out to the old agrarian valleys, and you will see the massive timber bank barns, built with their lower stone walls dug right into the cool northern face of the hillside, using the massive thermal weight of the earth itself to keep the livestock stable through the peak of July. These were not accidental designs. They were the practical answers of people who had to be self-sufficient or suffer the consequences. And you do not have to take my word for it, nor do you have to rely solely on the old lore handed down around a kitchen table. When the mechanical age began to creep across the country, early agricultural researchers realized that the old world understanding of passive airflow was too valuable to lose. If you look back into the archives of the government print shops, you will find USDA Farmers Bulletin number 1393, published in the spring of 1924. It was titled Principles of Dairy Barn Ventilation. Inside those faded paper-bound pages, engineers documented exactly how the natural buoyancy of air could be used to keep a massive wooden structure from overheating or turning foul. They measured what they called the atmospheric engine, proving that the heat rising off the floor could drive a constant, self-contained renewal of the entire interior air supply. Provided the low intakes and the high outtake flues were balanced in a precise proportion. They put numbers and diagrams to the very things my grandfather showed me on the peak of his roof. Understand this. The old ways do not lose their truth just because a newer, more expensive machine comes along. Decades later, when modern building science wanted to see if these passive traditional principles could hold their own against the rising cost of electricity, researchers at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory decided to put the air gap and the radiant barrier to the ultimate scientific test. Inside their large-scale climate simulator, they built identical residential roof assemblies and subjected them to the fierce, simulated glare of a midsummer sun. They tested standard unvented decks against roofs built with the exact traditional principles we have discussed. A low-emissivity reflective foil layer coupled with a continuous, breathing air gap underneath the rafters. The data returned by their digital sensors was absolute. The bulletins published by the laboratory showed that a simple radiant barrier installed with a proper, unobstructed airspace cut the daytime heat flow passing down through the ceiling into the living space by up to 50% compared to the standard unvented control roof. Think on that for a moment. Half the heat from the blazing sky was turned around and thrown right back into the atmosphere, carried away by nothing more than the natural rising of the air inside the channel. The modern instruments simply verified what the old master builders knew by simple intuition. You do not need to wage a violent, expensive war against the sun using a noisy compressor if you simply build the structure to invite the heat to slide away on its own. So now, the knowledge rests in your hands. Do not look at the house you inhabit as a rigid, unyielding box that you are powerless to change. And do not assume that you need a grand fortune or a team of specialists to bring these principles to life under your own roof. Traditional self-sufficiency is not about buying your way out of a problem. It is about looking at what you already have with an educated eye and working with the tools at hand. Tomorrow morning, when the sun is still low and the grass is wet, step outside and look at your home. Stop and think about the path the sun takes across your roofline. Find the cool northern or eastern side where the morning air lingers and open a low window there just a few inches to let the house drink from that pool of shade. Go up into your attic space with a flashlight. Clear away the old dust and the choked insulation that might be plugging up your eave vents, and give the roof deck room to breathe. If your western wall bakes in the low glare of the afternoon, go down to a local woodlot, get some simple timber, and plant a row of green, broad-leafed vines that will grow a living shield before the summer peaks. These are small, quiet acts, but they carry a deep weight. They require no monthly bill, no reliance on a distant power grid, and no complex machinery that will eventually break and demand repair. It takes only the willingness to observe the natural order, a little patience, and the labor of your own two hands. When you make your building breathe, when you shield its skin from the sun, and when you let the heat run out the top on its own accord, you are doing more than just cooling a room. You are stepping into that long, honorable line of keepers who understood how to live in harmony with the seasons, keeping their households secure, comfortable, and free. Try it on your own place. Start small, watch the draw of the air, and let the old wisdom do the work.